Today, I am dealing with the receptors, pathway, and processing of thermal sensations. Thermal sensation is a lateral column sensation. Here is a picture. I have taken it from Guyton. I will describe when I am going through. What are the various thermal sensations? Look here, our body detects changes in temperature above or below certain neutral temperature. The temperature, anything above or anything below, would be detected as a cold, is a hot or a cold. The temperature thus is monitored by the receptors located on the surface of the body, that is in the skin. So that means we have the temperature sensing receptors under the skin, and also temperature sensing receptors in the inner core of the body, especially in the hypothalamus. In both the situations, they sense cold and warm sensation. The sensation is detected by warm and cold receptors located in the skin and in the inner core of the hypothalamus. These sensations, these warm and cold receptors, they are present in spots or in a dense segregation. So these are warm spots and cold spots which are present all over the body. The cold and warm receptors are located immediately underneath the skin at discrete but separated points, and each having a stimulatory diameter around 1 millimeter. In most areas of our body, there are more cold receptors than warm receptors. The number in different areas of the body as below. In the lips, 15 to 25 cold points per square centimeter. In the tip of the finger, it's 3 to 5 cold points per square centimeter. In the trunk, either in the back or front, it is less than 1 cold point per square centimeter. So that means that this is how it varies in the different parts of the body. Correspondingly, the warm points are fewer, because you know that the warm points are 3 to 10 times lesser than the cold points. The receptors for thermal sensations, they are peripheral cutaneous receptors and central receptors. The peripheral cutaneous receptors are slowly adapting receptors. Suppose if you are feeling cold, you will continue to feel cold because it will not disappear. The sensation of a cold will persist. However, you may adapt because these receptors would be immediately when there is suddenly you are exposed to a cold room. Let me tell you a point. Suddenly you are taken to the cold room, you feel the real chill. When you stay in the cold room for a while, they get adapted, but they will not completely adapt. So these are slowly adapting. These remain. Detect changes in skin temperature, that is the ambient temperature or environmental temperature. Central receptors are located in the hypothalamus, the medial preoptic nucleus. They sense the temperature of the blood. That means whatever the blood going from the periphery and from the heart that reaches to the hypothalamus, that particular temperature is sensed. The cutaneous receptors for thermal sensations are categorized into warm receptors and cold receptors. These warm receptors are free nerve endings. They are free nerve endings. These receptors or warm spots are more in lumbar and gluteal area. For that reason, you may find that whenever you feel when you are exposed to the heat, then you will feel that the heat sensation on the back and the gluteal region. That is where they are densely located. Baseline discharge of these receptors is at around 38 degrees Celsius. As the temperature increases above 38, the discharge or the action potentials from these receptors will increase. However, they will increase up to 42 to 43 degrees Celsius. Then after that, the increase will not be same, maybe plateaus or decreases. And somewhere around 49 degrees Celsius, the increase is upset. That turns out to be a different picture altogether. And these warm receptors are carried by unmyelinated C fibers, slowly conducting. The conduction velocity may be around 1 to 3 meters per second, not greater than that. This is about warm receptors. The cold receptors, they are also known as a end bulb of Gauss, and also some free nerve endings. They are denser in the ventral side and the dorsal part of the body, the ventral aspect. So that is why whenever we are feeling cold, we try to cover up ventral side and the dorsal parts of the body. You start feeling cold if the temperature drops down from 32 degrees Celsius. Slowly you start feeling maybe comfort. Then around 25 or below, this becomes cooler and cooler. At 20 degrees, you feel cold, and at 15 degrees, you feel cold, and it will be at 10 degrees, it's very cold. Temperature effect is also been influenced by the current of air. That means a wind chill effect. If there is a same temperature, if the air is there is a wind there, so then you may feel cold. So the baseline firing of these receptors will start around 32 degrees Celsius, and the firing rate increases with the fall of temperature. These are carried by A delta fibers. That is a myelinated, thinly myelinated nerve fibers. Their conduction velocity is somewhere around 10 meters per second, plus or minus 5 or 6, or whatever may be the situation, at the maximum 20 meters per second. Here are the receptors. These receptors are a complex receptors which are expressed with a different type of channels. And these channels are known as a transient receptor potential vanillide 1 channel. This TRPV1 receptor that could be activated by the capsaicin, and that brings about that produces a generator potential here in this terminal. And this one would be activated at or above the temperature of 42 degrees Celsius, that is for the heat. And we have other channels. These are non-TRPV1 channels. They are not dependent upon this, and they will be one, that is one group. Another group is a TRPV3, that is a transient receptor potential vanillide 3, vanillide 4, that is TRPV3 and the TRPV4 channels. And these TRPV3 and V4 channels that detect the warmth from 27 degrees Celsius to 42 degrees Celsius. In addition, we have the voltage gated sodium channels. This is a NAV 1.8, and this one is a sodium channel that is not shown here because this entire thing is studded with the sodium channels. So that means these are all the heat sensitive channels. The cold nerve terminal is expressed with a more number of channels. One of them is a transient receptor potential menthol 8, TRPM8. cold sensitive channel. You know menthol. Whenever we eat menthol, we feel that the sensation of cold. Maybe you must have taken some lozenges for your cough or these things which contains a menthol, or even just you have consumed a menthol that produces the cool feeling. So these are activating these TRPM8 channels on the cold receptors that would produce the cold. So then we have other non-TRPM8 channels, the transient receptor potential ankyrin. Ankyrin is an alkaloid present in the garlic and in the bark of the cinnamon. So this transient receptor potential ankyrin TRPA that detects the temperature below 70 degrees Celsius. Then we have another thing, TRPV3 camphor. You know the camphor which is being used in the temples, either for burning or even it is placed in the particular tirtham, the water the priest gives. So that contains a camphor. This will activate the TRPV3 channels. TRPV3 is not here, so this becomes a part of the TRPV3 here. Then we have a potassium channels. These are a track and a track. This is a track channel. This is a track channel. These are potassium channels. They are also activated by the cold. In addition, the NAV 1.8, that is the voltage gated sodium channel 1.8, is also present, that will detect the cold. So that means these heat sensitive terminals and the cold sensitive terminals are heat receptors and the cold receptors. They detect or produce the generator potential using these channels. Because these channels, when they open up, they will produce the generator potential and then the action. Now, let us understand the dynamics of these warm and cold receptors and the channels. I just briefly read through these things. TRPV1, I will just say that a transient receptor potential vanilloid 1. This will detect warm. This is a warm receptor greater than 42 degrees Celsius. And this can be stimulated by capsaicin and even the ions. The effect is the warmth and the pain, because it is hotter side. 42 is more than 42 is becoming hotter. TRPV4, so this is in the range of warm, lesser than 42, 27 to 42. These are activated by the 4-ball esters, and these are innocuous heat. This is a inert heat, or this is not a very strong heat. Then P2X3 channels. These are ATP sensitive channels. These are ATP sensitive channels, or these are also known in the adenosine channels. These P2X3 channels, they detect the warm, because P2X3 means there is a more ATP production, and more ATP production produces the heat. They will detect the heat, that is the warm. Then TRPV3 channel, this is working somewhere around, the temperature is 33 degrees Celsius. And at this 33 degrees Celsius, they can be activated by the camphor. TRPV3 is activated by the camphor, and they will produce the mild cool effect, the comfort effect. Then TRPM8, this is M is for menthol. TRPM8 less than 25 degrees Celsius, it produces, its effect is cold. TRPA1, A1 is ankyrin, TRP-ankyrin. So this ankyrin is present in garlic. In garlic, it is present as allicin. In garlic, it is present as allicin, and in cinnamon also allicin is present. And TRPA1 detects lesser than 17 degrees Celsius, Enchirine is a natural agonist that is present in a garlic or cinnamon, known as allicin. It's a cold pain. Then we have a potassium channel, track 1. It detects the cold and it is mechanosensitive because of the wind chill effect, and this is cold. Then sodium potassium ATPase. This detects a cold and a cool. The sodium voltage gated sodium channel. This is a cold and a cool. All these things are abbreviations I had given here. And what abbreviation you have to remember: transient receptor potential, either vanilloid or menthol or enchirine, potassium channels, or sodium voltage gated sodium channel. So these are the various warm and cold receptors. Now, just hot temperatures in a noxious range. When you get the heat, it is more, when it is more than 42 degrees Celsius, it is hot. And this would activate TRPV1 and TRPV2. The TRPV1 is also activated by capsaicin and protons, ions. TRPV2 has the higher activation, that means higher activation threshold. That means when the temperature reaches above 48, 49 degrees Celsius. So that is where TRPV2 is activated. This is hot. Warm temperatures are in the moderate range or innocuous range. They are not dangerous. They work between 34 to 42 degrees Celsius. They are activated by the TRPV3 and TRPV4 channels. Cool and cold temperatures activate TRPM8, that is menthol, TRPM8, and TRPA1, that is enchirine. They activate that, these cool and cold temperatures. TRPM8 is also activated by menthol. Activation of TRPA1 at temperatures, A1 is enchirine, activates at a temperatures less than 17 degrees Celsius, produce painfully cold sensation. That means when you activate these channels, that produces the pain sensation. Now, if you are looking at this graph, this one I have taken it from Guyton's textbook of physiology. Let me check these dotted red lines. These are warm receptors. So here, this is the peak of the warmth. You just see that somewhere around 42 degrees Celsius, it is peak. Okay, so now the warmth sensation starts beginning to appear somewhere around 30 degrees Celsius and reaches its peak around 42 degrees Celsius. And after 42 degrees, it decreases. This is the warm receptors. Now, somewhere around 45 degrees Celsius, some other receptor getting activated. That is, you know that TRPV1 is getting activated at 42 degrees Celsius, and this produces the heat in the initial stage. And once it crosses a certain level, 48 or 49 degrees Celsius, it produces the pain. So that is why this is the heat and pain. So this is TRPV1 receptors. This keeps on increasing. As the temperature increases, it becomes painful. At this 55 degrees Celsius, it is pain only. Now coming back with the cold receptors, the cold receptors are maximally activated somewhere around 25 degrees Celsius. As the cold receptors, you just see that they start getting activated somewhere around 7 degrees Celsius. Somewhere around 10 they get activated, and slowly they will increase the temperature. And after 20 or 25, there will be some increase, and then there is a decrement. Here comes the dotted line. What happens? The less than 15 degrees Celsius, there is an increase in the activity of the nerve, and this produces the initially cold sensation followed by a painful sensation. Maybe around 4 degrees Celsius it is pain. You know that chill pains and the frostbite. the frostbite. Frostbite is when you are in a Himalayan expedition and you are there. There is a lot of these things, and you are all these things. So frostbite may happen if the temperature falls below 5 degrees Celsius. Now here, if you see this particular range, this is a freezing cold, cold, cool. This is neutral, indifferent, warm, hot, burning hot. That is how our temperature activity is been mentioned. That means from freezing cold to cold, cool, indifferent, warm, hot, and burning hot. Taking on this particular thing here, very cold below 10 degrees Celsius. This is very cold. Okay. Only the pain fibers are stimulated. At this point, if you are just seeing, pain fibers are stimulated. It is cool between 10 to 15 degrees Celsius. It's cool between 10 to 15 degrees Celsius. Cold receptors begin to be stimulated, reaching the peak stimulation at 24 degrees Celsius. 24 degrees Celsius. Fading out slightly above 40 degrees. So it becomes almost zero here. This is fading. That's around 24 degrees, 40 degrees Celsius. Now coming back here with the warm receptors, above 30 degrees, the warm receptors begin stimulated. Here, these are warm receptors. Above 30 degrees, they start stimulated. And fade out about 49 degrees, say somewhere around 50 degrees, they fade out. The peaking somewhere around 42 degrees Celsius. Around 45 degrees, pain fibers begin to be stimulated. These pain fibers means the burning hot, the cold heat is producing the pain. The pain fibers begin to be stimulated. And paradoxically, during this time, because of the heat, some of the cold fibers are also beginning to be stimulated, possibly because of the damage or destruction of the cold nerve endings by the temperature, because of the excessive heat. This is about the cold, cool, indifferent, warm, and hot feeling about the sensation. These cold receptors are carried by the A delta fibers, and these are the A delta fibers here, the number 1, and they are relayed in the lamina 1 and the lamina 5. This is cold sensation. Then warm sensation, this is warm sensation carried by the C fibers, and these are the C fibers here, the 1 and 2. Now, what happens? These fibers, either the cold fibers here and the warm fibers, when finally making a synaptic contact, the final synaptic contact, they will be ascending, or they will be ascending about 2 to 3 or about 4 segments above. So that forms a Leisser's tract. Leisser's tract. So that means these fibers do not suddenly enter into the nucleus and produce this thing. They will ascend up about 2 to 3 segments. Leisser's tract is a pathway formed from the proximal end of the A delta and the C fibers. These A delta and the C fibers, these fibers, when they make, they will ascend up and then down, and they will make a tract. This is called a Leisser's tract, and then after that they will be relayed into the lamina 5, lamina 3, or lamina 2, whatever they are destined to. So the Leisser's tract is a pathway formed from the proximal end of the A delta and the C fibers, which enter the lateral aspect of the dorsal horn. This is the lateral aspect of the dorsal horn, and ascend and descend up to 4 segments. That means you just see that 2 up, 2 down, and terminate in the laminae, principally 1, 2, and 5. 1, 2, and 5. You just see that 1, 2, and 5. I have already mentioned the warm receptors, free nerve endings under epidermis carried by C fibers, 1 and 2. This is 1 and 2. The cold receptors by the A delta fibers to DRG relayed in 1, 3, and 5 neurons. 1, 3, 3 I have not mentioned, but 1, 3, and 5 neurons. So that is about the distribution. Just I have added one more about a leisure tract. It may be a very brief note, and this leisure tract is formed either here for the thermal sensations or also for the pain sensation. This is present because 2 segments up, 2 segments down. Then they will make the synaptic contacts or relay. Now coming back here, here are the receptors. I'm talking about a pathway now. So here are the receptors, the cold receptors and warm receptors. The cold receptors, A delta fibers, warm receptors, C fibers. They ascend up, and this is a dorsal root ganglion. And then come here, layer 1, 2, and 5 of the lamina, and then make a synaptic or a relay there. In addition, they relay in a number of nuclei there. I don't want to describe them because these relay are important for the spinal reflexes. Okay, and the postural reflexes. Now, this one is the primary one. This is a projecting neuron to the thalamus. This is a projecting neuron to the thalamus. Make a synaptic contact, and this will be the beginning of the second order neuron. From the second order neuron, this will go into the lateral spinothalamic tract and ascend up to thalamus. If I take the section of the spinal cord at a cervical level, then I have this type of distribution: the sacral, lumbar, thoracic, and cervical from top to bottom. So that is the distribution of these segments. Then it will reach the thalamus. This is the lateral spinothalamic tract. You just see that whatever I have made, these are warm and cold receptors, and they come here, dorsal root ganglion, and make a synaptic contact. Maybe you have the leisure tract being made, and then they ascend up. This ascend up as a lateral spinothalamic tract, and this is thalamus. And from here, the thalamus, once it's relayed into thalamus, from thalamus, it will reach to the primary sensory area, S1. Okay, so now what I have mentioned, the same thing, warm and cold receptors via DRG, relayed into the dorsal horn neurons, lamina 1, 2, and 5. The fibers cross. So you just see that the fibers are contralateral side. Fibers cross to the opposite side and ascend as a lateral spinothalamic tract and relay in ventro-posterior-lateral nucleus of thalamus. Ventro-posterior-lateral nucleus of thalamus. Third order neurons from thalamus terminate in the parietal cortex, S1, the Brodmann area 312. Further signals are relayed to S2 and other somatosensory association area. And from the somatosensory association area, the limbic cortex and insular cortex are being informed. So this is exactly this pathway is for what? This pathway is for the identification of the location of the warm or cold sensation, origin of the warm or cold sensation, and the intensity of the warm or cold sensations. So you just see the Q10 value of these thermoreceptors is for every 10-degree change, there it is a doubling effect. The number of responses are doubled. However, I have made additional things here that I would come back next. So now what happens once it is relayed into S1? Now this S1 is having that typical sensory homunculus for the medial lemniscal structures. You can just see that starting from the genitals, toes, foot, and the hip, leg, then neck and head there, shoulder, and arm, elbow, forearm, and you see the hand there. Then you have the little ring and middle and index finger. See that fingers are getting this much area. Then you have the eye, nose, face, upper lip, and the lips. That is, you just see this part. Then we have the jaw here, and we have the pharynx and internal structure. I am repeating for your revision purposes. So now lateral spinothalamic projections are represented in the cortex along with the medial lemniscal sensations. And you see that large areas of representations from the hand, finger, face, lips, tips, that little for the trunk and hip, least for the viscera. So that means you have, similarly, you have the warm or cold spots in these areas to a great extent. Area of the cortex assigned for a particular part is proportional to its functional significance. Maybe here there may be small differences in the distribution of the receptors, because this was for the medial lemniscal sensations. That is the fine touch and tactile discrimination and tactile localization. Okay, so now moving on to this thing, I mentioned the pathway described earlier. This pathway does not explain certain things, because the sensation of thermal sensation is important for hypothalamus. Thermal sensation is important for the autonomic system, that is through the reticular system. Now, in our connections, they did not figure out, they did not come in picture. The connections to hypothalamus and reticular system are not there. Therefore, it does not explain these connections. The second point, thermal related autonomic and behavioral responses, they cannot explain, the pathways cannot explain that. Now, looking at that, we have these pathways. What I have mentioned here, the same thing I have taken up, warm and cold receptors via DRG, relay in dorsal horn neurons, laminae 1, 2, and 5. Here, 1, 2, and 5. Then afterwards, cross, ascend as lateral spinothalamic tract, and relay in ventro-posterolateral nucleus of thalamus. Third order neurons from thalamus terminate to S1. That is what we have seen. That does not explain certain phenomena, because hypothalamus is not in loop. Now we have relays. If we examine, we have a collateral. See, as the lateral spinothalamic tract ascends up, it gives a collateral to the rostral ventral medulla, that is a reticular system here, parabrachial nucleus of the reticular system in the upper pontine region, and the mesenchymal midbrain, the periaqueductal gray relays, collaterals are there. So this one, and this one. And these relays, say for example, if I take up this relay, the rostroventromedullary, this thing. So this one, this forms the reticular system. This reticular system projects onto the thalamus, especially the thalamic part, the intralaminar or internal medullary lamina, and then on the reticular nucleus. So then when they are activated, that relays here in the, not in this VPL, so internal medullary lamina, and that would be just a arousal response or alerting response. So that is about the reticular system. And at the same time, these rostroventral medullary, these things would activate the respiratory and the cardiovascular centers for the autonomic responses. In addition, the sympathetic and parasympathetic system is also being activated. So these are the things happening because of this thing. However, If we are looking at another relay here in the parabrachial nucleus, I have made the green here, and the parabrachial nucleus. This parabrachial nucleus would talk to the hypothalamus. It has a connection with the hypothalamus. And from this hypothalamus, especially the preoptic nucleus of the hypothalamus, the medial preoptic nucleus of the hypothalamus. So then there are many things which maintain the temperature regulation. Now, from this hypothalamic nuclei, it is communicated maybe both way, bi-way, or reciprocal communication between amygdala. Amygdala and hypothalamus are interconnected. So amygdala here, a part of the limbic system. From the amygdala, it will amygdala talks to the insular cortex. Amygdala talks to the anterior cingulate cortex. The anterior cingulate cortex talks to the prefrontal cortex. So like that, this connects the entire range of the emotional components of the thermal activity. So now what I mentioned here, further signal, the parabrachial nucleus connects to hypothalamus, amygdala, insular and cingulate cortex, reticular and mesenchymal for arousal response. That's what I explained. Now let us go a little more further. Here, thermal afferents relay in the spinal gray matter and cross ascend to the lateral spinothalamic tract, that is known. Collaterals join in the rostroventral medulla, that forms the reticular system, and reticular system for arousal response, because from this reticular system it will go to the thalamus, intralaminar, internal medullary nucleus, and then activate the cortical areas and release into the parabrachial nucleus. You look at the parabrachial nucleus. From the parabrachial nucleus you have this amygdala, and from the amygdala you have the insular cortex, and from the amygdala you have the cingulate cortex activated. So this would produce the behavioral response. However, this diagram do not show the hypothalamic connections. That is why I have made a connection here. This is a hypothalamic connection. That means parabrachial nucleus may have a direct connection with the amygdala, as well as it has a connection with the hypothalamus. That is very, very important as far as the thermal sensations are concerned, because the hypothalamus, it has its own warm and cold receptors. Now let us examine what is the role of the parabrachial nuclei. Thermal relays in that means there are relays in the parabrachial nucleus. That's what you see this. Okay, the parabrachial nucleus connects the medial preoptic nucleus of the hypothalamus. This medial preoptic nucleus contains warm and cold receptors. Thus, the parabrachial nucleus provides the peripheral inputs to the central processor. The central processor is the medial preoptic nucleus. It has its own receptors. Both the peripheral and central are integrated in the hypothalamus. So that means this one try to give inputs to the hypothalamus, so it will help to integrate the peripheral inputs with the central inputs. Central inputs are coming from the blood itself because of the temperature of the blood, or a core temperature. Then comes the medial preoptic nucleus gives the excitatory signals to the intermediolateral column, because the medial preoptic nucleus of the hypothalamus gives back to the reticular system, and from the reticular system it activates the spinal sympathetic segments. That means a lateral column, lateral horn cells, the intermediolateral column, and that would be the sympathetic supply. And this would, when it is activated, that would produce the sweating that is known as a pseudomotor activity. And especially this is activated when you have been sensing warmth around. So that is to activate the heat loss mechanism. Then we have a dorsomedial hypothalamus. That means a preoptic nucleus talks to the dorsomedial hypothalamus and the posterior hypothalamus. And this time, the message to the intermediolateral column of this thing is different. That would activate the sympathetic activity that produces the vasoconstriction, that produces the piloerection, that increases the brown adipose tissue activity. So all, or even that increases the skeletal muscle rigors. All these things would be activated. So that is for the heat gain mechanism or heat producing mechanism, because the person is exposed to cold. So that means the preoptic nucleus monitors, depending upon the warmth or a cold, that would activate a certain set of nuclei in the hypothalamus. Then posterior hypothalamus projects to the reticulospinal tract. Now it will project to the reticulospinal tract. This reticulospinal tract monitors the gamma motor neuron activity. The gamma motor neuron activity increases the skeletal muscle contractions. So that means your muscles become tense. That means increased tone. Increased tone means increased heat production. Sometimes we have the shivering mechanism. So that is to produce extra heat. And at the same time, that would, in winter, you must have seen, you prefer to perform many of the activity, the sport activities or non-sport activities. Your activity pattern is increased. It is all to enhance the heat gain mechanisms or heat producing mechanisms. Okay, that is about the medial preoptic nuclear activity. Then comes the parabrachial nucleus, connects to amygdala, cingulate cortex, and the insular cortex. It is for the behavioral changes. I will narrate about these behavioral changes in my next slides. Now, let us see this. This is the part where I am talking about the medial preoptic neurons in the hypothalamus. And this medial preoptic neurons in the hypothalamus has a warm receptors and a cold receptors. You have this warm receptor and you have the cold receptors. And these warm receptors and cold receptors have a reciprocal connections. So this would inhibit the cold. When it is activated, it inhibits. When it is inhibited, it automatically inhibition is absent. Now what happens? This is a warm receptor sensed by the blood. At the same time, you get the warm receptor from the parabrachial nucleus, which is coming through the skin, and they are entering here through that thermosensitive laterospinothalamic tract. So they will activate these from the parabrachial and medial preoptic connections. So parabrachial, medial preoptic connections, these parabrachial and medial preoptic connections, these connections, when they are activated, they would activate here. That is why I said this integrates both these, the circle as well as the square. Now, so what happens here? So now, when it is activated, this is the warm receptors. This warm receptor, when it is activated, it increases the sweating mechanism, the pseudomotor activity. That is through the medial dorsal nucleus of the thalamus, the pseudomotor activity increases. You can see that this is the firing level of the pseudomotor activity. So it increases, so there is a sweating, heat loss mechanism is produced. At the same time, what happens? It suppresses the cold receptors. So that means the cold receptors means heat production is suppressed. Heat production, because these cold receptors, what they do? They increase the heat production and heat retention. How that heat production and heat retention? So this involves the dorsomedial and the posterior hypothalamic nuclei. So vasoconstriction, piloerection, brown adipose tissue, metabolism, gamma motor neuron activity, and shivering. Activation of these cold receptors, so that means it suppresses this so that there is no heat production, so there is a heat loss. That's the increased temperature. Suppose if you think that there is a decreased temperature. If there is a decreased temperature, so you just see the reverse of these things. This is not activated. If this is not activated, this is not inhibited. If this is not inhibited, this becomes prominent. There is an increased dorsomedial and posterior hypothalamic nuclei are set free. Vasoconstriction, piloerection, gamma motor neuron activity, shivering, and the increased adrenergic activity for the brown adipose tissue metabolism. This is in brief how the hypothalamus integrates these two phenomena, because they themselves have the warm receptors and the cold receptors, and these are reciprocally connected, and these warm receptors from the skin and the peripheral input are relayed into the warm receptors of the hypothalamus. Now coming back, just I am trying to summarize what I talked about the previous graph, that response to warm receptors. Needless to say about the first order neuron, the warm receptors, C fibers relay in lamina 1 and 2, the second order neurons in lateral spinothalamic tract, and the third order neuron relaying into S1 area, that is for localization and attributes of the thermal sensation. What type of a heat, what type of a cold, how it is it metallic or it's whatever. There are some attributes, is it wet or dry or whatever. Then the collaterals given to parabrachial nucleus, they become very important, because the parabrachial outputs, they go to the medial preoptic nucleus of the hypothalamus. The medial preoptic nucleus excites the pseudomotor activity, that is a sweating. That is what I have shown here. This one, heat loss, the sweating mechanism. The sweating mechanism is coming from the sympathetic nerves. So that means it is a separate channel by this thing which is being operated by the medial preoptic nucleus. Now, at the same time, the medial preoptic nucleus inhibits what? Medullary neurons, and decrease the sympathetic vasoconstrictor activity, and decrease piloerector contraction. That means inhibits the vasoconstrictor activity and the piloerector contractions. So that means there is no vasoconstriction, no piloerection. That means this is heat production. This is again facilitates the heat loss mechanism, because for sweating you need not to have the blood supply restricted. There should be vasodilatation. Then sympathetic tone to adrenal medulla is decreased because it inhibits here, and sympathetic activity increases overall the metabolism. In addition, it increases the metabolism of in the brown adipose tissue. That is a beta oxidation of the lipids. So that brown adipose tissue, that beta oxidation is enhanced by the adrenaline, and which is not stimulated. Then the medullary reticular system, it suppresses the medullary reticular system, or in the other way, it does not activate the medullary reticular system. In turn, the gamma motor neuron activity is diminished, or there is a decreased muscle tone and a decreased muscle activity. What happens when you have the heat? You want to just relax. You just want to spread out, throw your limbs, something like that. So that particular phenomena. Now, the parabrachial nucleus, because it's all the trick played by the parabrachial nucleus, it connects itself to the amygdala, cingulate, and insular cortex that provide the behavioral changes. So that means you are in a hot sun. What you are looking for? You are looking for a shelter, maybe a tree, a dense tree, wherein you can just get the heat, reduce the whatever the radiation or conduction or convection, whatever the physical means, the heat is coming to you. Then what happens? These amygdala and cingulate cortex that would enhance the laziness. So that means that it will not make you be very active, and that would make you feel drowsy, so that you will have less activity. So at this time, you don't want to eat much. Rather, you want to drink a lot of fluids. So that is what is been stimulating. Because of this, there will be a craving for cold drinks, ice cream, all cold stuff you may like to have. And you have these nice and cold desserts or food. So that's a craving for all cold items is there. Then in the you just look at that laziness, drowsiness, and you want to wear the loose and airy clothings so that your heat loss mechanism is facilitated. This is a behavioral response, not anybody's wish or will or a fancy. The loose and airy clothings, so that would help to lose the heat during because of the increased temperature. This is what happens when the warm receptors are activated. What happens when the cold receptors are activated? I would not talk about this first part wherein the cold receptors, A delta fibers, lamina 1, and going to the lateral spinothalamic tract and the thalamocortical projection, S1, and so on. This is for localization and attributes of that cold sensation. But the sensations reaching to parabrachial nucleus in turn connects the medial preoptic nucleus of the hypothalamus, and then that will connect to dorsal motor nucleus and the posterior nucleus of hypothalamus. Now, what happens? Because of the cold, the medial preoptic nucleus does not stimulate the pseudomotor fibers. That means the sympathetic activity that increases the sweating. So that output inhibits the fibers. Rather, I would say that it does not stimulate. You just see in this graph, see if whatever the inputs coming here, so the warmth, so it will not stimulate. This input is not there. If this input is not there, this input will not go there. This is not going there. There's a heat loss mechanism. At the same time, when this input is not coming, this is not activated. If this is not activated, so that means there is no inhibition on the cold receptors. And at the same time, there are some inhibitory parabrachial neurons. They will try to activate the C receptors. So they will enhance this heat production or heat retention. Now go back here. Sorry about that. Okay. So now what happens? The medial preoptic outputs inhibits pseudomotor fibers. There is no sweating. Sweating is for heat loss mechanism. Because you are exposed to cold, you don't want to lose heat again because you will become very cold. MPO now excites the medial preoptic nucleus, now excites the medullary neurons to produce the sympathetic activity that produces the vasoconstriction, increases the blood pressure, heart rate, and the piloerection. So you see the goosebumps when you are exposed to cold. The sympathetic tone is increased, and as such, the sympathetic activity increases the glucose metabolism that increases the heat production. In addition, it increases the adrenal medullary activity. This adrenal medullary activity releases an enormous amount of adrenaline. This adrenaline will again trigger the metabolism in brown adipose tissue that produces extra heat, what is called a non-severing thermogenesis. This non-severing thermogenesis becomes an important source of heat generation in infants, because in infants other components are not well developed, other thermoregulatory components are not well developed, and you have this brown adipose tissue that produces the heat production. So at the same time, the medial preoptic nucleus now excites the reticular spinal gamma motor neuron activity so that the muscle tone is increased and the severing takes place. So more heat is generated. That is about the medial preoptic activity. How about the behavior? The parabrachial projections reach to amygdala, cingulate, and insular cortex for behavioral responses. So now you want to go to a warmer place. That is your seeking for a warmer place. And what happens? Your appetite is increased. Appetite, you want to eat more, and you want to eat a protein rich diet or a high calorie diet. And this protein rich diet produces a extra calorigenesis, what is known as a specific dynamic action of a proteins. So that means a consumption of a protein rich diet increases extra calories. Say for example, the protein per gram releases about when it is metabolized, it releases about 4 kilocalories of energy. But in case of protein diet, there will be more than 4 kilocalories. So that means that is what the specific dynamic action. So that produces a heat. And now another behavioral aspect is it is because of the increased appetite. Another behavioral aspect here is you want to have a clothing or a draping. So you want to have, if you go to the northern area, you have two or three sweaters on with a jacket or a coat or a tie, everything, and a cap or even covering with everything. So that warm clothing you are looking for, and you will definitely find out. And your activity level is increased. You will crave for hot drinks and hot food, and so that you will add a heat to your body. So these are some of the activities in response to the cold receptors. So okay, that is how it is being projected. So that means what it is not just simply reaching. It's not just simply reaching to the sensory area one. It's more than that, these thermal receptors. So that is why I have taken this particular chapter separately. So these thermal sensations. The warm and cold receptors are present in skin areas and are carried by C and A delta fibers respectively, relay in the dorsal neurons, layer 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, and 5. The axons of these neurons cross and ascend as the lateral spinothalamic tract. The lateral spinothalamic tract gives collaterals to parabrachial nucleus in addition to its path to the thalamus, ventroposterior lateral nucleus, which from this VPL, there are thalamocortical projections reach the postcentral gyrus for sensory localization. The PBH, that is a parabrachial nucleus, relays to preoptic nucleus of hypothalamus. And dorsal motor nucleus and the posterior hypothalamic nuclei are connected from the preoptic nuclei, and which in turn connects to the limbic system. The VPL relay localizes give characteristic thermal sensation. Reticular and parabrachial connection to intralaminar and reticular nuclei of thalamus for cortical arousal response. The medial preoptic nucleus of hypothalamus, along with the dorsomedial and posterior hypothalamic nucleus, modulate the sympathetic activity for sweating, vasoconstriction, dilatation or vasodilatation, piloerection, voluntary or involuntary muscle activity, activation of the brown adipose tissue as required. The parabrachial projections to amygdala, cingulate, and insular cortex provide behavioral changes as required for the heat or cold responses. That's what the summary of today's chapter. I have referred the following books: Candle's textbook of neuroscience, the Guyton's textbook of medical physiology, Genong's review of medical physiology, and Samson Wright. And in addition, I have mentioned the references at a particular figures when I was discussing. Assignments, I will just give you a question. Name the receptors, pathway involved in thermal sensation. Give an account on physiological basis of frostbite. So draw a label diagram showing the hot and cold receptors. Differences between warm and cold receptors. Trace thermal sensory pathway and hypothalamic centers. Describe briefly the hypothalamic actions of thermal changes I had given. Maybe behavioral changes with a cold temperature, behavioral changes with the heat, or changes with the warm or changes with the heat. And you also mention about TRP channels and their implications. In my next lecture, I will take about physiology of the pain sensation. Thank you.